Hi, I'm Ed.
Hi, I'm Hugh, and welcome to part 2 of our series on restoring Chris Buck's vintage 1962 Stratocaster.
So what are we doing in this episode?
Well, basically, we're going to tackle one of the really tough parts of this job, which is restoring the fingerboard. So there's
Quite a state.
Yeah, there's some real complications here. It's in a real mess, partly because it has been partially refretted in the past and some damage was done to the board, particularly around the 3rd fret. The other thing is the guitar was so heavily played, like a lot of 60 Strats, it has this, it's like almost scalloped in between the frets and in the areas that were, played quite a lot. I don't know if it was like people had long fingernails, whatever, but just gouged out massive divots. So that's going to have to be sorted out.
You're saying it's partially refretted, and some of them were like a different colour and stuff?
Yeah, kind of like a gold brass colour. I was over at my mate Dave Durnley's place in Cardiff. He does what I do basically. He's a guitar builder and restorer.
Hi Dave, if you're watching.
and I went over with Chris and we were showing him the guitar. And Dave said, I recognise these. He said, I think these are old Hofner frets. And in all likelihood, in the UK in the mid to late 70s, which is when I think this guitar was initially refretted, or when this particular refret was done, that might have been pretty much all that was available. You didn't have, companies selling like loads of different gauges of fret wire so you could pick what you want. You needed new frets. Well, these were the only frets you could get.
You see that a lot with old sort of guitars, a lot of Strats in particular, don't you? The sort of make-do repairs and mods, rather than nowadays the world of accurate vintage parts and stuff is out there, and you can almost get the exact repro for it. It didn't exist, did it? And you kind of used what you had.
You did, which is why people ended up putting extra holes in pick guards and that kind of thing too. But you had to use what you had. I think a lot of people get a lot of flack for doing stuff that we consider to be like crimes against vintage guitars, but back in the day it was, if that was the only guitar you had and it wasn't a vintage guitar, it was just a second-hand guitar, you did what you needed.
And that's all relative, because certain mods that certain big famous players have done have become standard things and they're totally accepted, so it's all relative.
If you get famous you can do anything you like to your guitar and nobody's going to complain,
and people want to copy that, so you can't win. So
there's one other aspect of this board which is really kind of weird. Well, it's kind of weird, but I tend to see it a lot around here. I don't know if you guys have seen this on vintage Strats as well, or whether it's peculiar to this part of the UK, but this idea of varnishing the fingerboard. Now, I can only assume that it was done because people felt like a layer of polyurethane varnish would actually provide some protection to the board to stop it getting gouged up. But this has got a layer of really horrible varnish on it, which is kind of milky, opaque kind of thing. So I'm going to have to figure out how to get that off the board as well.
Protecting from the smoky and beer throwing clubs and so on, there's no doubt was played in back in the day, or they still exist now, as most of my gigs will attest to.
So basically what this video is going to be all about is pulling the frets out of the guitar and restoring the fingerboard, getting it level and getting it ready for new frets, and talking about the processes that are used, and hopefully get it looking quite acceptable.
I'm feeling much better as well, because it feels a bit all over the place at the moment, mucky. There's a lot of grime and
it's horrible, but ultimately at the end of it, I don't want it to look like a fingerboard that is fresh out of the factory. I don't want to over sand it, I don't want to over restore it. I want it to look and feel like a vintage Strat that's never really been messed around with. Maybe it's had a few running repairs over the years, but I want it to feel like a vintage guitar. It's one thing I've noticed with some vintage Strats that are, really beautifully restored, world-class fret jobs and stuff like that. Quite often they don't actually feel like vintage guitars anymore. They're great, they're beautiful to play, but it just that something has gone with the vibe, and that's kind of the tightrope you kind of walk doing these restorations.
Exactly, and it's down to individual player preference perhaps when it comes down to. I know I certainly prefer a more sympathetic restoration personally on my guitars that still feels, if you've got a vintage guitar, if you're lucky enough to have one, to me you want it to feel like an old guitar, it's had life, but different people have got different opinions, and
that's fair enough. So anyway, so let's crack on. see what we're going to do with the board, and hopefully you enjoy it. And we'll check back in at the end and tell you what's coming up next.
Brilliant, and remember to subscribe, and we'll see you in a little while.
Okay, we have a mixture of frets on this guitar. From the 14th fret onwards, we actually have the original Fender factory frets, which would have been installed sideways. And I've removed 3 of these replacement ones already. I've never seen anything quite like these. These are brass frets with tiny, tiny little bumps on the tang. So they certainly weren't glued in, and they're coming out very, very cleanly. So I'll just show you how I get one of these out. I'm not even bothering to heat the fingerboard. They're coming out so easily. There just really doesn't seem to be any point. Okay, let's have a quick look. So I start on the end. These are dedicated fret removal nippers. Just work it straight into the end of the fret. It just starts to lift up, and then what you can do, just very gently work your way along. And the nippers, because they have a taper on them, the very kind of sharp meeting edges, they basically just lift the fret out. There you go, clean as a whistle. Fingers crossed they all come out as well as that. These I'll be taking out sideways, which is the proper way to do it with vintage Fenders, arguably, I guess. As you can see, I've reinforced the sides of most of the fret slots with super glue, which I applied with a whip tip. It's a great little device. Directs the glue exactly where you want it to go, but you've got to be careful not to get it into the slots. You do get chips when you pull frets out, but I always think it's best to apply the glue as soon as it happens. If you leave it, those chips just tend to get lost. I don't even try and push them back down. The glue just kind of wicks in and then solidifies and stabilizes everything. When you sand the board flush, there'll be very little evidence you've done the repairs. I do want to point out fret 3 here, because it's easily the worst of the lot. I think whoever did the last refret had a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. This is a massive chip. It's more like a bunker, really. There's a lot of old glue along the edges of the slots, which I presume they put in there just to stop the fret from falling out. You can see me moving it with the blade. It looks like hide glue because it's dark brown and quite crystalline. So I'll need to do a lot of repairs here before I can get a fret back into this slot. Okay, well, vintage guitar enthusiasts of a nervous disposition should probably look away at this point. But I'm going to try and get this nut out. In one piece. And I think it's probably glued in. Okay. Looks like it's been shimmed as well. Okay. Getting there. And there you go. It's come out perfectly. That looks like the original nut to me. There's some weirdness on the bottom of the slot. Looks like paper actually. Wow. I wonder if that's tone paper. Maybe some kind of fiberboard. Anyway, it's out, and we'll put this with the parts and see if we can recycle it. Sometimes you can just glue a piece of rosewood veneer on the underside of the nut. It's very easy to trim it to an exact fit, and the rosewood veneer will just elevate the nut up to the point where the slots become viable again, and you can just carry on using the original nut. That's quite lucky to get that out of there in one piece, I think. I'm pleased with that. Okay, so I have a 7 1/4 inch radius sanding block here, which I've loaded up with 320 grit abrasive paper, which is actually really quite gentle. It's a bit wobbly, but only because I raised it up so I could get a halfway decent camera shot. I should stress that I'm not trying to radius the entire board here. I'm just trying to get the board flat across the top of the fret slots, so get past that super glue and just down to flat wood surface. But I'm absolutely not trying to sand through all the divots and the wear marks. Changed over to a flatter radius board here just to try and knock back the divot patches I made with rosewood dust and super glue, but they're a bit too far down into the wear spots really for the radius block to hit them. I'll have to do those by hand. Anyway, that's about it for sanding the board. I won't be doing any more than that. I've taken off a very, very small amount of rosewood. So this is the divot at fret 4, which is quite a nasty one, and I filled it with a combination of rosewood shavings that I filed from a rosewood blank and super glue. I rough up the bottom of the divot first with a craft knife to raise the fibres, sprinkle in the wood shavings, and then follow up with some super glue. When it sets hard, just sand it back almost to the surface of the board, and now I'm using a utility knife blade as a scraper just to bring it flush with the surrounding rosewood. As you can see from the colour, I'm not actually removing wood here, I'm actually removing glue. It's quite a delicate procedure, but should be possible to make this almost disappear, as you'll see shortly. So after I've done the scraping, I follow up with some pretty fine sandpaper. This is probably 320 grit, and I'll actually move through a few other grades of sandpaper usually, much as I would if I was prepping a nitrocellulose finish for final polishing. Just need to be careful here. I don't want to remove any wood from the top of the fret slot, just kind of feathering it in. Just removing some of the old glue from the fret slot itself now. This is the bit where we get to see if all the hard work's paid off. Just applying a little bit of fingerboard oil to fret 4, trying to keep it out the slots, just to give you an idea of how the board will look when it's been fully sanded and also oiled afterwards. I really like following up 320 grit paper with all the various finer grades of paper, and I even end up polishing it with micromesh. I love a really smooth feeling board, and I don't appreciate sanding lines in the rosewood. It just feels rough to play. Anyway, see now that the divot has pretty much vanished. Let's hope they all turn out this well. I'm using still photography to show how I restored fret slot number 3. Basically, the outside edges of the slot were completely blown out and would never have held a fret securely. So what I decided to do was cut slivers of rosewood, and I glued one sliver into the end of the slot, sanded it flush with the board, and then used the intact center section of the slot to guide my saw so I could re-establish a slot of the correct width. And then I did the same thing on the other side. Cleaning up the chip wasn't actually too bad. I used a small gouge that I have with a rounded blade to actually clean up the chip, and then I cut a fresh piece of rosewood using the same gouge so the curvature would match perfectly. It fitted straight into the cleaned up chip. I glued it down and sanded it flush, and I'm pretty pleased with the way it's turned out. And the board is finally done. I've sanded it to quite a fine sheen. Most of the fret slots look pretty clean. I filled the worst of the divots. You can still see the darker areas between some of the frets where they're really, really low spots, and the varnish is still on those. I'll address that once the frets are in, and I'll go in between the frets with some quadruple grade wire wool and clean off the remaining varnish. Most of those chips around the fret slots will be completely hidden by the frets, and I think this is going to end up quite a nice looking, quite a nice feeling board. Well, that was a hell of a lot of work, as you can see. In fact, I'd say that's probably the toughest fingerboard restoration that I've ever done, and I've come across some real howlers in the past.
It was like Wolverine had been at that guitar at times, wasn't it? But
yeah, but it's. I mean, obviously, it's still looking a little bit kind of gnarly around the fret edges and stuff like that, but they tend to. And after they've been defretted, and when the new frets go in, it's basically it should cover up most of the nastiness that you see. And yeah,
it's not kidding anyone. Everyone's going to know it's a vintage instrument with a great history, but hopefully it'll be much more playable.
It will. Yeah,
and it'll feel much better. It already feels much better with that, So
yeah, absolutely
brilliant.
So that's hopefully one of there's two parts of this job that I'm really kind of are kind of daunting. I mean, the first was the fingerboard, and that's done. I'm glad that's out the way and done with.
And the fitting the DiMarzio Super humbuckers and the Carla Trem.
Oh yeah.
That's going to be the
Carla
real
Trem. Yeah, that's going to be difficult.
Check for a later episode on fitting the Carla Trem, guys. It's going to be interesting.
No, we're not going to be fitting the Carla Trem as well, Welsh. The other bit that I'm apprehensive about, obviously, is the patching those holes in the pick guard, but that's a long way down the line.
Be interesting. Okay, well, thanks very much for watching. Check in for part 3. Please remember to subscribe. Leave us any comments, any information, any tips you guys can let us know.
Absolutely. And next time we're actually going to be getting on with fretting this guitar and beveling the edges and leveling everything all off, and hopefully getting this guitar to the point where we can actually put some strings on it fairly shortly and see what it sounds like for the first time.
Really looking forward to that. Great. Well, we'll see you next time, guys. Thanks very much. Hwyl fawr.
Ta bo.